My name's Ryan, I'm 42, and I've been married to my wife, Emily, who's 38, for 12 years. We've got 2 kids, a decent house in the suburbs, and until recently, I thought we had a stable marriage. A bit about me: I used to work in law enforcement. I spent a decade on the force before transitioning into private security, which gave me more time to be with my family. During my time as a cop, I worked with a guy named Eric, charismatic, ambitious, and the kind of guy who always seemed to be playing an angle. We were never close friends, but we worked together well enough. That was years ago, and we lost touch after I left the department. Fast forward to about 6 months ago, and Eric popped back into my life. I was at the grocery store when I bumped into him. We caught up for a few minutes, exchanged pleasantries, and he made a big show of saying how much he admired me for leaving the force to focus on my family. At the time, I didn't think much of it. When I got home, I told Emily about the encounter. Her reaction surprised me. She seemed more interested in Eric than I expected, asking a lot of questions about him. How we worked together, what he was like, struck me as odd, but I shrugged it off. Over the next few months, things between Emily and me started to feel off. She was on her phone constantly, giggling at messages she wouldn't show me. She started going out more, saying she was meeting friends or running errands that seemed to take longer than they should. When I brought it up, she'd roll her eyes and snap, "Not everything's about you, Ryan." One day, I came home early from work and found her in the kitchen, laughing on the phone. When she noticed me, she quickly ended the call. "Who was that?" I asked casually. "Just Sarah," she said, naming one of her friends. Her tone was dismissive, almost annoyed that I'd asked. But something about her answer didn't sit right with me. Sarah and Emily weren't exactly close, and the way she ended the call so quickly felt suspicious. I told myself I was being paranoid, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Little did I know that was just the beginning. The feeling that something was wrong with Emily didn't go away. Her behavior became more erratic. She was always glued to her phone, keeping it face down on the counter, and her excuses for being out late became increasingly flimsy. "I lost track of time," she'd say, or, "The girls wanted to grab drinks after dinner." One night, I decided to trust my gut. Emily was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the counter. Normally, I wouldn't invade her privacy, but the way she'd been acting made me think twice. I picked up her phone, and sure enough, there was a text from a contact labeled Sarah. But it wasn't Sarah. The message read, "Can't stop thinking about last night. When can I see you again?" My chest tightened as I scrolled through the conversation. It wasn't long before I found his name, Eric. The texts painted a clear picture. Flirty banter, suggestive comments, and mentions of sneaking around when I wasn't home. It was like a punch to the gut. My former colleague, the guy who had once looked up to me, was now sleeping with my wife. When Emily came out of the shower, I couldn't even look at her. My mind raced with questions, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. But I didn't confront her then. I needed more than just a few texts. I needed proof she couldn't deny. The next day, I installed a small camera in the living room, hidden in plain sight among the shelves. It felt extreme, but I had to know the full truth. It didn't take long for the camera to confirm my worst fears. 2 days later, while I was at work, I checked the live feed on my phone during lunch. There they were, Emily and Eric, sitting on the couch, laughing and leaning into each other like teenagers. And then it escalated. Eric kissed her, and she kissed him back without hesitation. I sat there, staring at my phone in disbelief, my hands shaking. I felt humiliated, betrayed, and furious all at once. This wasn't just some fling. It was happening in my house, in the life I'd built for my family. That evening, I decided it was time to confront her. That night, as I sat at the dinner table with Emily and the kids, I could barely hold it together. Every laugh she faked, every word out of her mouth felt like a slap in the face. I couldn't take it anymore. After the kids went to bed, I found her in the living room, scrolling on her phone like nothing was wrong. I stood in the doorway, my chest tight with anger. "We need to talk," I said, my voice sharp. She glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "What now?" "I know, Emily," I said, stepping closer. I know about Eric. Her face froze for a moment, her eyes widening. But then, just as quickly, she composed herself, letting out a scoff. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, I said, pulling out my phone. I opened the camera app and showed her the footage of her and Eric on the couch, their little rendezvous in plain view. Her expression shifted from shock to anger. You were spying on me? She snapped, standing up. Are you serious right now, Ryan? You don't get to turn this around on me. I shot back. You brought him into our house. You lied to me, snuck around behind my back, and now you're mad because I caught you. She crossed her arms, her jaw tight. It's not what it looks like. Oh, really? I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Because it looks like you're having an affair with a guy I used to work with. A guy I trusted. She hesitated, her bravado cracking for just a moment. Okay, fine, she said, her tone defiant. I made a mistake. But maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't have felt the need to look elsewhere. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Boring? I repeated, incredulous. Is that seriously your excuse? You've destroyed our marriage, and that's the best you can come up with. You don't get it, Ryan, she said, throwing up her hands. Eric actually listens to me. He makes me feel wanted. Something you haven't done in years. I stared at her, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. So your solution is to sleep with him? To invite him into our home like it's some kind of joke? She didn't answer, just stood there glaring at me, her arms crossed like she was the victim in all of this. I'm done, Emily, I said finally, my voice cold. This marriage is over. Her face wavered, but she quickly hardened again. Fine, she said, her voice icy. If that's what you want. I walked out of the room, my hands shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. I couldn't believe this was my life now. After that confrontation, the house became a war zone of silence. Emily moved into the guest room, and we barely spoke except for basic exchanges about the kids. The tension was suffocating, and every glance she gave me felt like a reminder of what she'd done. I spent my days at work trying to focus, but my mind kept drifting back to Eric and Emily. I couldn't shake the image of them together, laughing on the couch like they had no care in the world. It wasn't just the betrayal that haunted me. It was the smugness of it all. Eric knew me, worked alongside me, and still had the audacity to do this. Emily didn't try to apologize or explain herself further. It was almost like she was waiting for me to cool down, to pretend everything could go back to normal. But I wasn't going to let that happen. One evening, while the kids were at a sleepover, I sat her down in the living room. She looked annoyed, like I was interrupting her night. We need to talk about the next steps, I said firmly. Next steps? She said, raising an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean divorce, Emily, I said bluntly. This marriage is over. I can't forgive what you did, and I won't pretend that we can move past it. She scoffed, leaning back in her chair. Oh, come on, Ryan. People make mistakes. You're really going to throw away our marriage over one bad decision? One bad decision? I repeated, my voice rising. This wasn't a mistake, Emily. You made a choice, over and over again. And you didn't just betray me. You brought him into our home, into our lives. How do you expect me to move past that? She didn't have an answer, just sat there glaring at me. Do you even feel guilty? I asked, my voice trembling. Her expression softened for a moment, and she looked down. Of course I do, she said quietly. But, I don't know, Ryan. Things between us haven't been great for a while. You're always so focused on work, on being the perfect dad, that you barely even see me anymore. Her words stung, but I refused to let her off the hook. And instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix it, you ran to Eric? She didn't respond. I stood up, shaking my head. I've already talked to a lawyer, I said. We'll figure out the paperwork and set up a co-parenting plan. But this is done, Emily. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. For the first time, she seemed to realize how serious I was. Ryan, wait. But I didn't wait. I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the mess she'd created. After that conversation, There was no turning back. I called my lawyer the next morning to start the divorce process. The decision felt both empowering and devastating. This was the woman I'd built a life with, the mother of my kids, and now I was dismantling everything we had. But I knew there was no other option. Emily's reaction to the divorce papers was predictable. She accused me of being cold and vindictive, claiming I was overreacting. "You're just doing this to punish me?" she said one night as I sat at the kitchen table, filling out paperwork. I looked up at her, my patience wearing thin. "This isn't about punishment, Emily. It's about finally respecting myself enough to walk away from someone who doesn't." She didn't say anything after that, just stormed off to the guest room and slammed the door. Meanwhile, I started taking steps to rebuild my life. I moved some of my things into a friend's spare room to create distance while we figured out the logistics of separating. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than living under the same roof as Emily. Eric, on the other hand, had been surprisingly quiet. I expected some kind of smug message or lame apology, but there was nothing. That made me even angrier. He didn't just betray me. He acted like it didn't even matter. One afternoon, while the kids were at school, I decided to confront him. I drove to the station where he still worked and waited in the parking lot until I saw him walk out. "Eric," I called out, stepping out of my car. He froze, his expression shifting from surprise to unease. "Ryan," he said cautiously, "what are you doing here?" "I think you know," I said, crossing my arms. "You want to explain why you thought it was okay to sleep with my wife?" His face flushed, and he glanced around like he was hoping someone would come to his rescue. "Look, man, I didn't mean for it to happen. It got out of hand." "Got out of hand?" I repeated, my voice cold. "You call sneaking around with my wife in my house, while my kids were there, getting out of hand? Do you even hear yourself?" He stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. "Ryan, I'm sorry, okay? I made a mistake." "Don't give me that," I snapped. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice. And now you get to live with it." For a moment, he just stood there, his mouth opening and closing like he was searching for words. I didn't wait for him to find them. "Stay the hell away from me and my family," I said, turning and walking back to my car. Driving away, I felt a surge of relief. Confronting Eric hadn't fixed anything, but it gave me a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. After confronting Eric, I felt like I'd closed one door in a house full of broken windows. It wasn't a full resolution, but it gave me a small sense of control over a situation that had left me reeling. Emily, on the other hand, became increasingly hostile as the divorce process unfolded. She stopped trying to justify her actions and instead leaned into bitterness. "You're just trying to play the victim," she spat one evening during a tense conversation about custody arrangements. "I'm not playing anything, Emily," I said calmly. "I'm just done pretending this marriage is something it's not." We agreed to joint custody of Liam and Mason, which was the only part of the process that felt straightforward. For all her flaws, Emily loved the boys, and I didn't want to deprive them of a relationship with their mother. But I made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate her using them as pawns in whatever games she wanted to play. With the divorce moving forward, I started focusing on myself and the future. I moved into a small rental house closer to the boys' school and spent my free time making it feel like home. I let Liam and Mason pick out decorations for their rooms, and their excitement reminded me why I was doing all of this. To give them a stable, happy life, even if it looked different now. I also reconnected with old friends, people I hadn't seen much of since getting married. One night, my buddy Jake invited me over for a poker game. Sitting around the table, laughing and swapping stories, felt like a breath of fresh air. "You look better, man," Jake said as we shuffled the deck for another round. "Like you're finally coming back to life." "Feels like it," I admitted. Therapy became a regular part of my routine as well. Talking to my therapist, Kara, helped me process the whirlwind of emotions I'd been carrying. Anger, sadness, humiliation, and, surprisingly, guilt. "Why guilt?" she asked during one session. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I keep thinking about what she said, about me being boring or not paying enough attention. What if she's right? What if I pushed her away? Kara shook her head gently. Ryan, her choices aren't your responsibility. Relationships take work, yes, but cheating isn't the answer. She could have communicated with you. Instead, she chose betrayal. That's on her, not you. Her words stuck with me. For so long, I'd carried the weight of Emily's accusations. But I was starting to see that her actions said more about her than they ever did about me. As the months passed, I began to feel more like myself. The initial sting of betrayal had dulled, replaced by a steady resolve to focus on what really mattered. My kids, my happiness, and building a future that didn't include Emily's toxicity. Liam and Mason adapted well to the new custody arrangement. They'd spend weekdays with me and weekends with Emily. At first, I worried about how the transition would affect them, but they seemed to thrive in the more peaceful environment. Without the constant tension between Emily and me, the house felt lighter, calmer. One night, after tucking Mason into bed, Liam came into the living room and sat next to me on the couch. "Dad?" he started, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Are you happy now?" His question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask, buddy?" I replied, putting an arm around him. He shrugged, looking down. "I don't know. You just seem different. Like, not as mad all the time." His words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much the tension with Emily had affected the boys. "I think I'm getting there," I said honestly. "It's been a tough year, but having you and Mason around makes everything better." He smiled, leaning into me. "I'm glad you're happy, Dad." Moments like that reminded me why I'd made the decisions I had. I also started rediscovering parts of myself I'd lost during my marriage. I joined a local hiking group, something I'd always wanted to do but never found the time for. The fresh air and camaraderie were a welcome escape, and it felt good to challenge myself physically. At one point, someone in the group mentioned a local 5K charity run. On a whim, I signed up. Training for the race gave me a sense of purpose, a goal to work toward. When race day finally arrived, crossing the finish line felt like more than just a physical achievement. It was a symbol of how far I'd come emotionally. Emily, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling. The boys mentioned that she was moodier than usual, snapping at small things or spending long hours on her phone. I tried to stay out of it. Her life was no longer my concern, but I made sure the boys knew they could always come to me if they needed to talk. One day, out of the blue, Emily sent me a text. "Emily, can we talk? Just the two of us." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Me? About what?" "Emily, I just think we have some things to figure out. For closure." I debated whether or not to meet her, but ultimately, I agreed. Not for her sake, but for mine. I wanted to hear what she had to say and close this chapter of my life once and for all. When Emily asked to meet, I wasn't sure what to expect. Part of me worried she'd try to guilt me into reconciling, while another part hoped she'd finally take responsibility for her actions. Either way, I needed to hear her out, if only to close the door on this chapter for good. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop, a neutral location where things couldn't get too heated. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table with a cup of tea in front of her. She looked nervous, fidgeting with her phone until she saw me. "Hey," she said, offering a small, tentative smile as I sat down. "Emily," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, looking down at her tea. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. About us, about the boys, and about what I did." I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "And," she sighed, her eyes meeting mine. I'm sorry, Ryan. For everything. For how I hurt you. For what I did to our marriage. I wasn't in a good place, but that doesn't excuse what I did. I know I broke your trust, and I hate myself for it." Her words sounded sincere, but I wasn't sure if they were coming from genuine regret or just the realization that her actions had cost her everything. "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you saying this now, months after everything fell apart?" She hesitated, biting her lip. "Because I've had time to think. First, I was angry. At you, at myself, at everything. But now I see how wrong I was. And I needed to tell you that. I studied her, searching for any hint of manipulation or insincerity. Emily, I appreciate you saying that, but it doesn't change what happened. You made choices that destroyed our marriage, and I've spent months picking up the pieces. I can't forgive you. Not yet, maybe not ever, but I've moved on. Her face fell and she nodded slowly. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness, Ryan. I just wanted you to know that I regret everything. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words hanging between us. Finally, I stood up. Thank you for saying that. I hope you figure things out for yourself, Emily. But this is the last conversation we're going to have about the past. It's time to move forward. She nodded again, tears in her eyes. Take care of yourself, Ryan. And the boys. You too, I said before walking out of the coffee shop. As I drove home, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Her apology didn't erase the pain, but it gave me a sense of closure I hadn't expected. For the first time, I felt like I could fully let go of the anger and focus on the future. After that meeting with Emily, I felt like I could finally close the door on the past. Her apology didn't fix anything, but it allowed me to let go of the lingering resentment. It was freeing in a way I hadn't expected. I threw myself into rebuilding my life, focusing on creating a stable, happy environment for Liam and Mason. I started cooking more, experimenting with recipes that quickly became family favorites. Friday pizza nights turned into try something new nights, where the boys and I would make dishes from different countries. It was messy, chaotic, and absolutely perfect. One weekend, I took them on a camping trip, something we hadn't done in years. Sitting around the fire, roasting marshmallows, and laughing at Mason's terrible ghost stories, I realized these were the moments that mattered. Meanwhile, I started investing in myself, too. Therapy continued to help me untangle the emotional mess Emily's betrayal had left behind. I began journaling, writing down my thoughts and reflecting on the lessons I'd learned. I even dipped my toes into the world of dating again. At first, it felt strange, awkward even, but it was also exciting to meet new people. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just the chance to connect and see what was out there. One night, at a casual get-together with friends, I met someone. Her name was Nicole, and she was nothing like Emily. Where Emily had been sharp and dismissive, Nicole was warm and attentive. We talked for hours that night, and for the first time in a long time I felt a genuine spark. We started seeing each other casually. Coffee dates, hikes, and long conversations about life. I wasn't ready to introduce her to the boys yet, but she understood. She wasn't in a rush, and neither was I. Emily, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling. The boys mentioned that she was distant and spent most of her time on her phone or watching TV. I stayed out of it. It wasn't my place to worry about her anymore. But I made sure the boys knew they could always talk to me if they needed to. One night, after putting them to bed, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the stars. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. The more time passed, the more I realized how far I'd come. My life looked completely different than it had a year ago, but in many ways it was better. Simpler, calmer, and filled with moments of genuine happiness. Liam and Mason were thriving in the new routine. They'd adjusted to the joint custody arrangement, and our time together felt more meaningful than ever. Mason's love for art continued to grow, and he even asked if we could take a painting class together. Liam, on the other hand, had become obsessed with soccer, and I found myself on the sidelines of every game, cheering like a madman. Nicole became a steady presence in my life. We weren't rushing things, but every time we spent time together, I felt more certain that I'd found someone who genuinely cared about me. She was patient, kind, and supportive, a stark contrast to the dynamic I'd had with Emily. One afternoon, while the boys were playing in the backyard, I caught myself smiling as I watched them chase each other with foam swords. I hadn't smiled like that in years, and it hit me. I was happy. Not the fleeting, surface-level kind of happy, but the deep, content kind that comes from knowing you've weathered the storm and come out stronger. Emily, on the other hand, was still struggling. She reached out occasionally, usually about logistical things with the boys, but there was an underlying sadness in her tone. Once, she even said, "You seem like you're doing well."
I'm glad.
I thanked her but didn't elaborate. Our paths had diverged, and I wasn't interested in revisiting the past. Looking back, I've learned a lot from this experience. Betrayal is one of the hardest things to go through, but it doesn't have to define you. It hurts like hell, but it also forces you to take a hard look at your life and decide what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not. For anyone out there dealing with something similar, my advice is this: trust your gut, set boundaries, and don't be afraid to walk away from people who don't value you. It's not easy, but on the other side of that pain is a life you can be proud of. Today, I'm living that life, and for the first time in a long time, I'm excited about the future. Thank you for staying with me. This crazy journey is finally over and I'm ready for what's next. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more interesting stories. And leave a comment with what you would do in this situation. See you in the next videos.